Okay, so I'm supposed to talk about naturalization of military members and veterans. I'm an attorney at Cascadia Cross-Border Law Group in Anchorage, Alaska, and a retired lieutenant colonel in the military police in the Army Reserve. Served 28 years. I'm still technically in the military. I'm in the retired reserve right now. Let me see if I can go ahead and. Okay, so immigrants in America's military history, very important part of America's military history. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute, but I'm going to talk about that for just a couple seconds and then go into how the current system affects the military, who's allowed to enlist, and how you can get naturalized through military service. And of course, we're the nation of immigrants. We think of ourselves as a refuge for the tired, the poor, the huddled masses yearning to breathe free. Unfortunately, this is a myth, American historical myth. We are no longer a nation that welcomes the homeless, tempest-tossed anymore at all. In fact, we try to keep them out if we can. Immigrants in military history, long, proud history, starting with the Continental Army. Approximately half the Continental Army during the Valley Forge era was immigrant. And so many of them were immigrants that when Baron von Steuben showed up at Valley Forge and was speaking in German, they told him he didn't need to translate into English any of his orders because all the troops could understand German. Because a lot of them were German immigrants in Pennsylvania who had joined the Continental Army. How do we know that? Because we know from the records of people who were captured by the British who was actually in the Continental Army, and there were just piles of immigrants. Then the Civil War for the Union was basically won by the large number of immigrants serving in the Union Army during the Civil War. There were also immigrants serving in the Confederate Army, but luckily the Union Army had more of them. That was a big part of the Union Army. There's a song that I really like to play for people. It's not politically correct. It's called Dixieland by Steve Earle, and it's about an Irish immigrant who was kicked out of Ireland for being a Fenian, which is an old term for terrorist. And he joined the Union Army and went to Gettysburg and fought against the South and won the Battle of Gettysburg as part of the 20th Maine. Kind of a famous story, but there's a good song about that you ought to listen to. And then immigrants continued to serve in the military post-Civil War era. They got their citizenship through military service. I have a great grandfather who served. He's a native-born American, but he served in the U.S. Army in the late 1800s with Arthur MacArthur in the Philippines. And I've got his census record from the late 1800s. It's the page of the census record for his military unit that lists all the people in his military unit, and a bunch of them were immigrants. Italy, Mexico. Can you believe immigrants from Mexico were serving in the U.S. Army in the Philippines in the 1800s? Russia, Germany. His unit was just full of immigrants. In World War I, about 18% of the U.S. Army was made up of immigrants. That's what this book's about, The Long Way Home. It's called The Long Way Home because the immigrants were trying to escape from the Kaiser and other totalitarian rulers in Europe, and they would come to America and get drafted and turned into U.S. citizens and sent back to fight against their former countries. And that was kind of the standard MO in World War I with the U.S. military. They had basic training naturalization back then because they wanted to naturalize all the troops before they sent them overseas. World War II, same thing. They were naturalizing all the troops before they sent them back overseas. There's a book about that called Sons and Soldiers, and it's all about how the German Jewish refugees who came to America, what we would call undocumented immigrants, undocumented special immigrant juveniles is what we would call them today, got drafted into the U.S. Army, turned into citizens at basic training, and sent back to be part of the military intelligence units on the Western Front during World War II. And they were responsible for 60% of the actionable intelligence on the Western Front during World War II. Korean War, same thing, drafted people, sent them over to fight. The Vietnam War was pretty interesting because at that point, there were a lot of undocumented immigrants in America, but the men who were undocumented were subject to the draft. And they got drafted by the U.S. military and sent over to Vietnam without having any immigration status. And they were allowed to fight for the U.S. military without having any immigration status. And they could get their citizenship through military service. The most famous person to ever do this was a man named Al Rascón. Al Rascón was from Mexico. By his account, he crossed the Rio Grande on foot with his family when he was a child, and he was undocumented. But he got drafted during during the Vietnam War, and he went over to Vietnam and served, and he got the Congressional Medal of Honor for his valor and service. And they let him naturalize through military service. And then later on, he was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor and acknowledged for his service. And he got citizenship through military service. And then they made him the director of the draft, which I think is rather ironic. He was the director of selective service. But those are some of the stories. And of course, service of immigrants has continued to this day, although DOD has become increasingly anti-immigrant and has made it harder and harder for people to enlist if they're immigrants. Today in America, we have a pretty bad immigration situation. Mainly, I would blame Congress and our national leadership for making this mess that they've made. It didn't used to be that hard to get legal, but today it's very, very difficult for people to get green cards. And the system doesn't make any sense. It's arbitrary, capricious, and irrational. But we have a lot of undocumented, unauthorized immigrants in America today. Mostly it's because it's not their fault. Nobody wants to be illegal. We have backlogs and quotas for legal immigration. We have fewer people getting green cards, more people with precarious statuses that aren't really a green card, and a messed up immigration law that even the United States Supreme Court does not understand. So it's very difficult and complicated and doesn't make any sense. Everyone out there in the public who doesn't know anything about this thinks there's some path to citizenship that's really easy. You start off as an alien, a non-immigrant, or a non-citizen, and then you become a non-immigrant somehow, and then you get your green card, and then you become a citizen. It's supposed to be really easy if you just get in line and do this. The reality is it's not that easy. If you do qualify, though, it takes like 5 to 15 years to do this. Most people don't qualify. I like to show people this flowchart from Reason Magazine. This is the how to get a green card. And you'll notice the stop signs everywhere. And that's because most people don't qualify for a green card in the world. And if you do qualify, it's really difficult, and you probably need a lawyer and have to pay them thousands of dollars to get you a green card, and it'll take 5 to 15 years. But the people living in America today, a lot of people also don't understand this. There's native-born citizens, naturalized citizens, non-citizen nationals. They're not citizens, but they're nationals. This is confusing because all citizens are nationals, but not all nationals are citizens. And then there's lawful permanent residents, people with a green card. Then there's a bunch of non-immigrant legal aliens who are legally here, but they don't have green cards. And then there's the crowd of unauthorized immigrants. Now, the government can't tell who's which all the time, and they can't tell by looking at you which one you are either. The blue box surrounds the people who are eligible to join the military right now. So right now, the only people eligible to join the military are native-born citizens, naturalized citizens, non-citizen nationals, and green card holders. They used to let non-immigrant legal aliens join, but they stopped that program under the Trump administration the last time Trump won. It was suspended under Obama, but then Trump permanently killed it. So today, if you want to get in the military, you got to have a green card. And when David, who spoke earlier, enlisted, you were required to have a green card to get in. You weren't allowed to come in as a foreign student. Today, we've got a huge percentage of the population that's foreign born. It's the highest since the pre-World War I era, and that's part of the reason why everybody's all in a fury about immigrants, because I think it's just socially difficult for people to comprehend that there's just this large number of foreign-born people in the population. But we've been there before, and this happened in American history before. This isn't anything new. When bad stuff happens in the world, people head for America. This has been going on since the dawn of the Republic, so it's not anything too new. But the military depends on these folks to meet enlistment goals. And this is the law that governs the enlistment. It was passed in 2006. Before this law passed, by the way, anybody could join the military in wartime by law, but not by regulation. So when I said David, when he came in, technically he wasn't eligible to enlist because DOD policy said you had to have a green card. He didn't have a green card. But the law says now a person can enlist only if they're a national of the U.S., and that includes citizens, because all citizens are also nationals, but not all nationals are citizens. And then an alien who is lawfully admitted for permanent residence, and that means somebody with a green card. And then there's an exception for 3 countries that have treaties with the U.S. These 3 countries are Micronesia, Republic of the Marshall Islands, and Palau. And those 3 countries have their citizens are allowed to enlist in any branch of the military if they want, because they don't have military armed forces in their countries. And the U.S. military is pledged by treaty to defend those 3 countries as if it were the United States. So the people in those countries who want to join the military are allowed to join without restriction. They don't have to have a green card. They can just sign up for military, even if they're here on a visitor visa, whatever. But they can naturalize through military service as U.S. citizens if they want. A lot of them don't want to, but they can if they want. but we are pledged to defend them. So if you run into one of those folks, they're special. Micronesia, Marshall Islands, and Palau. Green card soldiers are very high quality soldiers. This has been documented. The Center for Naval Analysis last did a report in November 2011. Interestingly, DoD doesn't want them to do another report because the DoD pitch today is that immigrants are bad and they don't want them in the military. So they don't want any more reports coming out. And they keep suppressing the draft reports that say that people are high quality. So the last report that came out was November 2011, and it said they were only 4% of enlisted accessions. That means 4% of people coming in, but they were far less likely to quit than the citizen recruits. And it's dramatic if you go look at the numbers. The green card soldiers are just much higher quality in terms of they're better behaved, less likely to get busted for anything, less likely to do drugs, less likely to have any kind of behavioral issues. They're just really high quality soldiers. So you're probably wondering, how come they're only 4% when they're like 13.5% of the population? That's a total mismatch. Well, that's true, and that's why DoD has recruiting problems. DoD doesn't want immigrants in the military, and so they basically restrict them from enlisting. And they're 13.5% of the population, so they're going to have a recruiting problem. Just like if they decided they didn't want women in the military, they would have a recruiting problem because women are, about half the population or more. Or if they decided they didn't want Latinos in the military, they would have a recruiting problem because Latinos are a significant chunk of the population. But DoD has explicitly decided that they don't like immigrants and they want to try to keep them out. And they want to basically, they do it by requiring a green card, and you can't get a green card, so therefore you can't get in. So that keeps the accessions rate really low. So it's tiny percentage of the military. We know from the Mavney program that if they lifted the green card bar and let legal immigrants who didn't have green cards into the military, they would have no recruiting problem at all, no crisis in recruiting. They would have tons of high quality recruits, but DoD does not want that for political reasons. Okay, this is the law that currently applies, 8 United States Code 1440. It's also called INA 329 by immigration lawyers. The U.S. Code sections have two different ways that you can refer to them. One is the INA reference and one is the code reference. And so 8 United States Code 1440 is INA 329, go figure. And this says anybody serving honorably in active duty status or as a member of the selected reserve during a wartime period as designated by the president can be naturalized whether or not he has been lawfully admitted to the United States for permanent residence. So this openly says that if you're an undocumented immigrant and you're serving in the military, you can get your citizenship as long as you served on an active duty status or in the selected reserve during a wartime period. Okay, so no green card required. You just got to be serving in the military in active duty or selected reserve. People always ask me, what's a selected reserve? That's the National Guard or the reserve components of the United States Armed Forces. And there's 6 components right now, or 6 branches: Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, Coast Guard, and Space Force. All of them have reserve components except for the Space Force. And the Air National Guard is part of the Air Force. Army National Guard is part of the Army, and those are also part of the selected reserve. So this is what the law says. And then the wartime military exception means you can go from being an alien, which is the statutory term. It's considered derogatory today, but basically going from a non-citizen, whether you're legal or illegal, to being a citizen in less than 6 months. You don't have to have a green card. You don't have to have any status. You can be deportable. It's basically a pretty good deal. So we're going to go through this pretty fast, but there's another law called 328. That's the peacetime military naturalization statute. That one only works if you have a green card. So it doesn't work for most deported vets because most deported vets don't have a green card. But it does work for people who didn't manage to serve on active duty or in the selected reserve. I recently was able to get somebody naturalized who never had active duty or selected reserve service, but he served with under 328 and he had a green card, so he was eligible to naturalize under that provision of the law. Okay, so DoD got totally anti-immigrant in late 2017 under the last months of the Obama administration. This was because Obama appointed somebody bad to DoD, a high-level position at DoD. This person basically bought into the Kool-Aid that immigrants are bad for the military. and they decided to stop military naturalization. So they kind of dropped off the cliff under this individual. And then this person stayed in office under Trump and then stayed in office. Biden promoted her. She's still serving at DOD and does not like immigrants in the military and would prefer to recruit white supremacists rather than recruiting immigrants. So they dropped off the cliff there. Okay, when you're analyzing cases, if you're a lawyer, you probably want to, I'll share this slide with you. You can put this in your kit bag. These are the options for a military vet who's thinking about naturalizing. They can naturalize as a regular old person with a green card if they've been a green card holder for at least 5 years. Why would a vet want to do that? Well, maybe because the vet doesn't have an honorable discharge. And that's an option for people that don't have an honorable discharge. If they've had a green card for at least 5 years, they can naturalize as a civilian, but they have to meet the civilian naturalization requirements. I did this with a vet recently in California who told me he'd been to a bunch of legal service providers who told him he wasn't eligible to naturalize because he had bad paper. And I wasn't going to be able to get the bad paper reversed. They had tried that multiple times, but I got him naturalized as a civilian. So this is an option. So he's a citizen now, but he didn't get his citizenship through his military service because he had bad paper. And then you can also naturalize if you're married to and living with a U.S. citizen and you have a green card. But again, in both of these cases, you have to have a green card when you apply, and you have to have had the green card for 5 years or 3 years. If you never had a green card, your only option is serving in the armed forces during wartime, and you have to serve during a specified wartime period. This is the option that's most available to military vets who don't have green cards. This is the only option really for them. And this one's great because you can do this even if you've been deported, if you're outside the country, you can still naturalize. The first two options you can't do if you're outside the country. You can't do if you lost your green card. But number 3 there, served in the armed forces during recognized periods of conflict, works. And then the last one is 328. And I don't use 328 at all for most vets unless they didn't serve on active duty during a wartime period or they didn't serve in the selected reserve during a wartime period. So for example, if you have a green card holder who served in the military, but they didn't have any post 9/11 service, then I don't have an option of doing 329. I just can't do it. So I'm going to have to do 328. So 328 is available in peacetime, wartime, anytime at all, but you have to have a green card on the date you file your application. Okay, so that one's a little bit trickier because most people don't have green cards who are trying to naturalize in this crowd. Okay, general requirements. You have to show good moral character, knowledge of English, knowledge of U.S. government, demonstrated attachment to the U.S., and their discharge from the military has to contain the word honorable or the word uncharacterized somewhere. Okay, so it can't say other than honorable, dishonorable, bad conduct. There is no filing fee. That's really a good thing. Okay, so discharges. This is the key chart for the discharges. You can naturalize through military service, assuming you're otherwise qualified. If you have an honorable discharge, a general discharge under honorable conditions, or an uncharacterized discharge. The reason you can use uncharacterized is because my firm filed 2 lawsuits, one in California and one in Minnesota, for soldiers in the Army who had been discharged from training with an uncharacterized discharge. And the government said they weren't eligible to naturalize. So we sued, and we got 2 federal judges to rule in our favor on the same day, coincidentally, one in Minnesota and one in San Diego, California. And both judges said you could naturalize with an uncharacterized discharge because it's not dishonorable or bad. You know, it's considered a neutral discharge, so it doesn't show bad character. And interestingly, USCIS did not appeal either decision by the judge. They just decided to change their policy. So if you go on their website today, you'll see that they note that uncharacterized discharges make somebody eligible for naturalization. And they cite one of the cases that we won. They don't cite the other one. I'm not sure why, but they cite the one in Minnesota and say that the judge told them they have to do this. And they never appealed that decision, so it's set in stone now across the country nationwide. Okay, if you get an other than honorable discharge, a bad conduct discharge, or dishonorable discharge, or if you're an officer, if you got a dismissal, but that's pretty rare because officers are supposed to be citizens, then you're not eligible to naturalize through military service. And the only option is to either upgrade your paper, get it up to general discharge under honorable conditions, or naturalize as a civilian with a green card. So you have to have a green card to do that. Naturalize as a civilian. Okay. And how do you figure this out? If you're not familiar with military records, you look at the DD 214 or other records. This has been a bone of contention with USCIS. They think everybody has a DD 214. If you'll notice by reading the terms at the top, a DD 214 is only a discharge from active duty. It is not a discharge from reserve service. And USCIS gets really confused about this. And I'm always lecturing them about me as an example. Okay, so I served for 28 years and I'm in the retired reserve. In my whole entire career, 28 years plus my 10 years of what being a retired person, um, I never got a DD 214 for any of that reserve service. The only time I ever got a DD 214 was when I was on active duty for 2.5 years and somebody bothered to give me one at that point. And I went on and off active duty as a reservist multiple times, all over the place, tons of active duty. And they never gave me a DD 214 because I was a reservist. They didn't care. They were just like, oh, that's too much trouble. We're not giving you a DD 214. So I don't have any DD 214 to document my military service at all. The only thing I have is one from back in 1988. Okay, so this is something that USS seems not to get. The VA gets it. If you go ask the VA what documents provide proof of military service, they'll say, oh, DD 214, blah, blah, blah. And they got 40 other documents that you can use to document your service. But USCIS is hung up on the DD 214 and they're always asking for it. And I have kind of a template letter in my office where I write them back in kind of snitty tones and I go, you asked my reservist for a DD 214. Please note it's a discharge from active duty. My reservist is still serving and doesn't have any active duty, therefore he has no DD 214. Okay. Reservists do get them sometimes, but not all the time. So that's just something to keep in mind. Okay. And then theoretically, they can do everything overseas. So all these deported vets, my reading of the law is they could just naturalize everybody overseas. But USCIS has decided to interpret the law very narrowly because they said the title of the law in question leads them to conclude that it's only for active duty people that can be done overseas. I think they're dead wrong on that, but I haven't been able to get them to actually read the text of the law instead of looking at the title of the law. So today they refuse to naturalize anybody overseas unless they're active duty, which is pretty ridiculous, frankly, because we could save a lot of time and energy if we just do the naturalizations overseas. They will do naturalizations at ports of entry. I had a client who was a military vet, honorably discharged, had a pretty extensive criminal record that barred him from entering the United States, but he was eligible to naturalize. So what happened was we arranged for USCIS to show up at the port of entry in Canada, at the northern port of entry there, in a building that was straddling the border. And he came in from the Canadian side and stood in a classroom and got interviewed and took the oath and everything on the Canadian side of the border with the U.S. CIS officer who had driven up from Seattle who had come in from the southern side. So it was pretty weird because nobody went through the port of entry. I came in from the U.S. side. He came in from the Canadian side. We met in this classroom. We did this whole interview and everything. And then they gave him the oath and they made him a citizen right there on the border with Canada. Not actually sure if the ground under him was American or Canadian at the moment he took the oath, but he's a citizen today. Okay. And then technically, they can take away your citizenship if you don't serve honorably for 5 years. That's in the law. Do they ever do that? Yeah, they do it if you're a really bad actor. You get your citizenship and then you go be a terrorist or a criminal or something. They'll try to take it away. But they have to do that in federal court by filing a civil lawsuit. And they haven't done it very much. Okay, INA 328, peacetime. I mentioned this before. You have to have a green card at the time of filing, and 1 year of any kind of military service will work for this. Okay, so you just have to, you can be a retired reservist or anything you want. Just green card at time of filing and 1 year of any kind of military service at any time. Okay, and I see there's a hand up. So do you guys want me to answer questions before I finish or?
No, Margaret, we'll save this to the end. I think I see a couple
Okay,
people in there, so keep going, please.
all right. Okay. And then wartime, you don't have have to have any particular immigration status, but you do have to have 1 day of active duty or selective reserve service. And you can file even if you're in deportation proceedings or even if you've been deported. And this is the law, and I showed it to you before. And this is the executive order. This is still in effect, although Trump may revoke it. Who knows? But this is a Bush executive order that declared 9/11 to be a period of wartime service, and it's never been this executive order has never been terminated, so it's still in effect today. If it does get terminated, then there won't be any more 329 wartime naturalizations, and people will have to get a green card before they naturalize if they enlist after the termination of the executive order. Okay, good moral character. To naturalize through military service, you do have to have good moral character. This is a technical term. This is also a shock to many deported vets when they find out they have to meet this requirement because it doesn't make any sense. But there's a rule that you can't have any aggravated felony convictions after 1990, November 1990. That's an absolute bar to military naturalization. We can't do anything about it. We can't reverse it. We can't overcome it. If you have one of these so-called aggravated felony convictions, you're just in deep doo-doo. You can't naturalize. You might be able to get your green card back. I've done that for a number of people, got them their green card back, but they can't ever get their citizenship. It's a permanent bar to naturalizing. So the only fix is for that one is you got to get your criminal charge vacated or changed to something, or you got to hope the Supreme Court decides that whatever you did was not an aggravated felony after all. Aggravated felony is a really technical term. It's not a logical term. It's random and arbitrary and capricious and irrational. But if you have one of those, you're tagged with this dirty A on your forehead and you can't get rid of it. Okay? And you cannot naturalize with it at all. There's no exceptions in the law. There's nothing, no exceptions, period. Okay. You can blame Congress for that. And I get a lot of deported vets who get really angry and upset when I tell them I can't do anything to help them and they think I'm being mean and whatever, rotten because I won't help them. And I say, well, I just can't help you. You have this thing called an aggravated felony conviction. Unless we can get rid of the conviction, we cannot naturalize you. And they think it's like me being a mean lawyer, but I'm not being a mean lawyer. I'm just trying to tell you the facts, okay? The sun's going to come up in the morning and I can't do anything about it, okay? So that's just a fact of the law. We've been trying to get that changed, but nobody's succeeded so far in getting Congress to change the law. You can also be deemed bad character if you lie to them under oath, okay? And they love this. So they love to call somebody in for a naturalization interview and then they start questioning you and they get you to say something bad. Okay. And so this guy on the right, Zhilong Zhu, he went in for his naturalization interview and they just got him to say something that they thought wasn't true. And then they said, "You lied to us under oath." Okay. In his case, he said that he didn't know the fake university that DHS was running was a fake university. And they said, "You're lying. You must have known our university was a fake university." And literally, the guy didn't know that, but they said, "No, you're lying about that." They get military people for this all the time, and it's stupid stuff. This is a real denial decision on a military vet. They're denying him for lying under oath at his citizenship interview. What was he lying under oath for about? Well, he had these tickets that were really old that he forgot about. Okay. Defective headlight, driving the wrong way, storing residential bulky waste longer than 7 days, and having a dilapidated accessory structure. Okay. And he apparently forgot about some of these and didn't admit them during the interview. So they're denying him for lying about this stupid, idiotic tickets. Okay. And I kid you not, this is an actual denial decision. I just cut and pasted it out of the denial because he came to me afterwards. Okay. Wacky. So what do you do with cases like this? You refile the case 1 year after the alleged lie, and this time you don't lie, you admit everything, and then you get naturalized. So you're just playing a game with USCIS, but usually you need a lawyer to do that. Okay, can this veteran naturalize? Everybody knows Hector, right? I hope everybody knows Hector. So this is the big question. Hector thought he couldn't naturalize. A bunch of people told him he couldn't naturalize. The government told him he couldn't naturalize. He came to talk to me. I said, "Hector, I think you can naturalize. I think you're not an aggravated felon, but nobody knows that. So we're going to have to straighten that out." Okay. So then he got the ACLU involved. He had an honorable discharge. He wasn't a conscientious objector. He did have this criminal thing that they said was an aggravated felony, but it turned out it wasn't. And then to top it off, he also got like a pardon from the governor. So that was no longer a bar to naturalization, although people told Hector for years that he was not eligible to become a citizen. He's your example today. He's a citizen today. Okay, he overcame that barrier. What did he do? He did two things. One is he argued to them it wasn't an aggravated felony after all. And two, he got a pardon to get rid of it. Okay, so that's what you can do for that one. All right. There's some processing issues. I'm just going to skip over these, but basically, they don't have to process your case fast anymore. They used to, but they don't anymore. So this is a procedure. You get your DD-214, you get your N-426 if you're still serving, DD-214 or other records, I should say. If you're a vet with a DD-214, you don't need an N-426 anymore. They eliminated that requirement. You file by mail or electronically. I highly encourage people to file electronically because you can do it anywhere in the world. Super easy. I do it on Zoom calls with vets all the time. I don't have to be in the same place with them. I just put them on a Zoom call. We share the screen. We file electronically. You have to do biometrics. Then you do an interview, test, oath ceremony, and if you get denied, you file a lawsuit and you sue them. Okay, DoD has made it harder for people to naturalize because they made it harder for people to get their N-426 certified, but that doesn't affect veterans. And then DoD is constantly trying to make it harder for people to naturalize through military service. Even now, they're trying to, the Biden administration is supporting an old Trump policy that Trump put in place back in 2017. They're appealing it to the circuit court, saying that DoD should be allowed to say whether you get to naturalize or not DHS. They want DoD to be the up or down, and that would be bad because DoD is like out of control and anti-immigrant. How do you get a veteran back into the country? If they are admissible to the United States, you can get them back in on a B-2 visa, which is a visitor visa. There's a foreign affairs manual provision that says people that are not inadmissible otherwise, and that's kind of complicated, but if they're basically have a clean record, they can come into the U.S. as a visitor specifically to pursue a military naturalization application. So that's helpful if you got a vet overseas who hadn't been deported and is otherwise admissible. Otherwise, you got to get parole from USCIS or CBP or somebody. All three of the agencies can give paroles out, but ICE and CBP and USCIS fight over constantly about who's allowed to give out paroles. All of them can do it legally. They just don't want to. Um, and there's no more expedited citizenship anymore for military vets. Somebody earlier, speaker earlier mentioned MV. MV has been a big disappointment to me. I mean, I thought I was all excited about it when it came out, and for the first few years, it seemed to like be trying really hard, but it's sputtered and died now, from what I can tell. And I don't think Trump is gonna do anything with it. So you can still put in your request to them and see if it helps, but my experience with them lately has not been a positive one. I think they're just not, they don't care anymore. And then veterans' family members are eligible for immigration benefits, but I'm out of time, so I'm not going to talk about that. Okay, you can ask me later. All right, do we have any time for questions? I know I'm 2 minutes over.
Margaret, thanks so much. We
All right,
might, on the back end of this, we're going to bring some folks in, but folks, as you can see from Margaret's presentation, this isn't a black and white issue. It doesn't get clear
it's
cut. There's
not
so many different things. Margaret,
super
I wrote
complicated. Yep.
absolutely, and I have a couple questions that definitely will keep you on and ask you towards the end. But I did want to bring my good friend. Thank you, first of all, Margaret. Thank you so much for all that information. Again, this is clearly this is not something that's super simple, and it's something that we should, that different stories clearly that we've already heard from the beginning, and now we're gonna hear a little bit more again.
Okay, and
Every
thank you
story is
for letting
different.
me speak, and thank you for voicing my concern that deported vets don't yell at me because of the law. I didn't make the law, okay? So I know people get really upset at me all the time because I'm telling them they can't get their citizenship, but I didn't make
Yeah,
the law, okay? It's Congress. All right.
and that's what we
Thank
got
you.
to change, right? Thanks
All
so
right.
much, Margaret.
Yep.